The Middle East is on the brink. US warplanes are striking Iran, ballistic missiles are flying across the Gulf, Iraq is erupting into chaos, and Iran has just made a chilling declaration about nuclear weapons. Is this the beginning of a much bigger conflict that could reshape the world? Stay with us until the end for the full story. And if you value sharp analysis and breaking geopolitical updates, make sure to like, comment, share, and subscribe right now so you never miss what happens next. It is June 28th, 2026, and the situation across the Middle East has escalated dramatically overnight. A series of interconnected military and political developments have pushed the region into one of its most volatile moments in recent memory. The United States has launched substantial military strikes against strategic targets inside Iran. In response, Iran has fired ballistic missiles and deployed drones against American positions in Bahrain and Kuwait. At the same time, Iranian state media has publicly declared that the Islamic Republic now sees the acquisition of nuclear weapons as necessary to eliminate future military threats against the regime. Meanwhile, Iraq has witnessed significant military activity, with special operations forces entering Baghdad's green zone and engaging in armed confrontations with security personnel linked to Iranian-aligned political figures. In Lebanon, military operations continue as tensions remain unresolved. All of these developments are unfolding simultaneously. More importantly, they are taking place just days after a ceasefire and memorandum of understanding were intended to reduce tensions and create a pathway towards stability. Instead, the agreement now appears either effectively broken or hanging by the thinnest of threads. To understand how the region reached this point, it is necessary to begin with the American strikes that triggered the latest chain of events. US Central Command confirmed that American forces conducted additional strikes against multiple Iranian targets on June 27th, following direct authorization from the Commander-in-Chief. According to the official timeline released by Washington, Iran was given an opportunity to comply with the ceasefire after earlier military exchanges. That opportunity, according to American officials, was rejected. Instead, at approximately 4:30 a.m. Eastern Time, forces linked to the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps launched a one-way attack drone against the MT Cuckoo, a Panama-flagged oil tanker transiting the Strait of Hormuz. The vessel was carrying more than 2 million barrels of crude oil. This was not an isolated maritime incident involving a minor commercial vessel. It was a direct strike on a major component of global energy infrastructure during a period when a ceasefire was theoretically in effect. The economic implications alone are substantial. In response, US forces launched a new wave of military operations targeting Iranian surveillance systems, communications infrastructure, air defense networks, drone storage facilities, and mine-laying capabilities. Footage released by the Pentagon showed multiple precision strikes, large secondary explosions, and extensive damage to what appeared to be military installations and airfield infrastructure. These operations were clearly designed to achieve more than symbolic deterrence. They represented a significant escalation beyond the previous round of strikes conducted only 48 hours earlier. The objective appears straightforward: to degrade Iran's ability to threaten commercial shipping and regional stability. President Trump later confirmed the operation through a public statement, declaring that American aircraft had targeted Iranian missile storage sites, drone facilities, and radar installations in response to violations of the ceasefire agreement. However, it was his broader warning that attracted the greatest international attention. The president stated that there may come a point at which the United States would no longer be able to exercise restraint and would instead be compelled to complete the military objectives it had already begun. He then delivered an unmistakable warning, stating that if such a scenario emerged, the Islamic Republic of Iran would cease to exist. This is not the first time such language has been used during the current crisis. However, the significance lies in the fact that the warning has now been repeated in the aftermath of a second major confrontation. For governments across the Middle East, for NATO allies assessing American intentions, and for international markets attempting to measure geopolitical risk, The central question is whether Washington intends those words to be interpreted literally. Iran's response arrived quickly and demonstrated little indication that previous American military actions had altered Tehran's strategic calculations. Following the U.S. strikes, Iranian forces launched retaliatory attacks against American-linked positions in Bahrain and Kuwait. Kuwaiti authorities confirmed that air defense systems were actively engaged in intercepting hostile aerial threats over national territory. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps subsequently announced that 8 American military infrastructure sites had been targeted through a coordinated operation involving both drones and ballistic missiles. Footage released by Iranian sources showed multiple missile launches taking place in sequence. These were not improvised weapons or limited tactical systems. They represented the very missile capabilities that American forces have repeatedly sought to degrade through successive military campaigns. That fact leads directly to what may be the most significant revelation to emerge over the last 24 hours. According to reporting from senior defense sources, Iran has spent the ceasefire period rebuilding key military capabilities that had previously been damaged or destroyed. Air defense networks, missile systems, surveillance assets, and drone infrastructure appear to have been restored to a far greater extent than many policymakers anticipated. If those assessments are accurate, the implications are considerable. It would suggest that while diplomatic negotiations were underway and international attention focused on political agreements, Iran was simultaneously using the pause in hostilities to reconstruct elements of its military architecture. The very systems that American forces targeted earlier in the conflict may now be operational once again. That possibility fundamentally changes the strategic debate. It raises serious questions about whether the ceasefire created a pathway to peace or simply provided valuable time for military reorganization. As events continue to unfold, that question may prove central to understanding not only the current escalation, but also the broader direction of the conflict in the weeks ahead. What emerged over the following hours may prove to be the most important strategic revelation of the entire crisis. According to reporting from senior American defense officials, Iran has used the ceasefire period not to de-escalate, but to systematically rebuild military capabilities that had previously been damaged during earlier phases of the conflict. The issue came into sharper focus after questions were raised about why American forces were once again striking locations that had already been targeted multiple times since military operations began earlier in the year. The explanation provided by a senior defense official was striking in its simplicity and significance. Iran, the official stated, has reconstituted key elements of its missile and air defense infrastructure along the Strait of Hormuz since the conclusion of the previous American bombing campaign. Areas that had already been subjected to extensive military action were reportedly rebuilt, reorganized, and returned to operational use. According to the assessment, substantial damage had certainly been inflicted, but Iran had spent the intervening weeks moving assets, restoring systems, and reconstructing critical facilities. That detail deserves careful attention. For approximately 10 weeks, a ceasefire remained in effect. During that period, diplomatic negotiations dominated international discussion. Governments focused on agreements, frameworks, and political solutions. Yet behind the scenes, Iran appears to have been rebuilding the very capabilities that military operations had sought to neutralize. In strategic terms, this represents a profound challenge to the assumptions underpinning the ceasefire itself. The purpose of the diplomatic pause was to create an opportunity for a long-term settlement before Iran could recover militarily. Instead, critics now argue that the ceasefire may have provided precisely the conditions Tehran required to restore its operational capacity. Time is often the most valuable resource in any military confrontation. In this case, Iran appears to have used that time effectively. As a result, American aircraft are now returning to target locations that were previously struck months ago. The difference is that many of those facilities have reportedly been rebuilt, resupplied, and reinforced. Intelligence assessments suggest that some air defense systems may even be more capable today than they were when the ceasefire first came into force. If those assessments prove accurate, They carry implications far beyond the battlefield. The issue is no longer simply whether military operations were successful in the short term. The larger question is whether the broader strategy succeeded. The assumption behind both the ceasefire and the subsequent diplomatic framework was that military pressure had weakened Iran sufficiently to create a genuine opportunity for a lasting political settlement. Events now suggest that assumption may have been overly optimistic. The evidence emerging from recent operations indicates that while military strikes inflicted significant damage, they did not prevent reconstruction. Instead, Iran appears to have used the pause to rebuild and reposition. That reality helps explain why American forces are once again conducting extensive strike operations against targets that had already been attacked earlier in the year. Attention must also turn to Iraq, where developments overnight have received less international coverage than they arguably deserve. In Baghdad, Iraqi security forces launched operations against political figures widely regarded as being aligned with Iranian interests. Reports from the capital described intense exchanges of gunfire within the Green Zone, the heavily protected district that houses key government institutions and diplomatic facilities. The operation centered on efforts to detain politicians facing corruption allegations. While the legal basis of the arrests rests on domestic Iraqi law, the political significance extends far beyond routine anti-corruption enforcement. Many of the individuals targeted have long been associated with networks that maintain close ties to Tehran and have historically played a role in facilitating Iranian influence within Iraq. The response was immediate. Security personnel connected to those political figures resisted arrest, leading to armed confrontations with Iraqi Special Operations Forces. Video footage circulating from the scene showed armored vehicles moving through central Baghdad, tanks entering key areas, and heavily equipped security units engaging in active operations. The images are remarkable. Tanks operating inside Baghdad's Green Zone is not a sight associated with political normality. It reflects the seriousness of the situation and highlights the growing tensions surrounding Iranian influence within Iraq's political establishment. Prime Minister Mohammed Shia al-Sudani has gradually increased pressure on Iranian-aligned factions throughout the broader regional crisis. However, this latest operation represents the most direct and visible challenge yet to those networks. There is widespread speculation that the move may have been coordinated with, or at least encouraged by, American officials seeking to reduce Iran's ability to project influence through Iraqi institutions. What makes the operation particularly notable is the legal framework under which it is being conducted. Rather than pursuing terrorism-related allegations, Iraqi authorities are relying on corruption charges. This distinction is politically important. It allows Baghdad to present the operation as a domestic law enforcement matter rather than an explicit alignment with American efforts against Iran. Whether that distinction remains sustainable will depend largely on how events develop in the coming days. For now, what is clear is that Iraq has become another critical arena in the broader regional struggle. The confrontation is no longer confined to direct military exchanges between Iran and the United States. It is increasingly extending into the political institutions, security structures, and power networks that shape influence across the Middle East. And as those pressures continue to build, the consequences are likely to extend far beyond Baghdad itself. While Iraq was confronting its own internal tensions, another critical front remained active in Lebanon, where developments continue to complicate any realistic prospect of a sustainable ceasefire across the region. Lebanon has increasingly become the connecting thread linking multiple areas of confrontation. What happens there directly influences events elsewhere, particularly in the Strait of Hormuz, where maritime security remains under constant pressure. Reports emerging from southern Lebanon indicate that Israeli forces conducted additional airstrikes against positions and infrastructure associated with Hezbollah in the Nabatea region. This area has remained a focal point of military activity for months and continues to witness regular exchanges between Israeli forces and Hezbollah fighters. From Tehran's perspective, Lebanon remains central to the broader dispute. Iranian officials have repeatedly argued that Israeli military operations in Lebanon represent a violation of the Memorandum of Understanding that was intended to reduce hostilities across multiple fronts. Tehran maintains that continued Israeli action undermines the spirit of the agreement and provides justification for its own retaliatory measures elsewhere in the region. Israel, however, has adopted a very different position. Israeli leaders have consistently stated that operations against Hezbollah will continue regardless of wider diplomatic arrangements involving Iran. In their view, agreements negotiated between Washington and Tehran do not impose restrictions on Israel's right to act against what it considers an immediate security threat. The result is an increasingly unstable dynamic. A framework agreement announced only days ago was intended to establish a pathway toward Hezbollah disarmament and the gradual reduction of military tensions in southern Lebanon. Yet despite those diplomatic efforts, meaningful implementation remains limited. Military operations continue, and each new strike risks triggering further escalation. This matters because every Israeli operation in Lebanon is now being cited by Iran as justification for subsequent actions elsewhere, particularly against commercial shipping routes in the Gulf. However, even these developments may be overshadowed by what could become the most consequential announcement of the entire crisis. Iranian state media has publicly declared that the Islamic Republic now sees the acquisition of a nuclear weapon as essential to removing future military threats against the country. That statement marks a significant shift. For years, debates surrounding Iran's nuclear ambitions have centered on assessments, intelligence reports, diplomatic interpretations, and strategic speculation. Ambiguity often characterized official messaging. Governments analyzed intentions while attempting to determine how close Tehran was willing to move toward nuclear weapon capability. The latest declaration changes that discussion fundamentally. Rather than relying on strategic ambiguity, state-affiliated media has openly presented nuclear acquisition as a logical response to the military pressure Iran currently faces. In essence, the argument is straightforward. If military intervention remains a recurring threat, then obtaining a nuclear deterrent becomes a strategic necessity. Should this position reflect actual state policy, the implications are profound. The diplomatic framework established during recent negotiations was intended to create a mechanism through which Iran's nuclear program could be constrained, monitored, and ultimately resolved through political means. The objective was to prevent weaponization while reducing the risk of military confrontation. Yet the message now emerging from Tehran suggests a different calculation. Instead of viewing military pressure as a reason to limit nuclear ambitions, elements within Iran appear to see it as justification for accelerating them. In that interpretation, a nuclear capability is not simply a symbol of power. It becomes an insurance policy against future military intervention. The logic is familiar within international security debates. Nuclear-armed states are often viewed as significantly more difficult to confront militarily than non-nuclear states. From this perspective, crossing the nuclear threshold fundamentally changes the strategic environment and reduces vulnerability to external pressure. The timing of the announcement is equally significant. It arrives while American aircraft are conducting strikes against Iranian military facilities and while Iranian missiles continue to target positions linked to the United States and its allies. Under such circumstances, the declaration appears designed to send multiple messages simultaneously. First, it signals to Washington that military operations are not producing the deterrent effect American planners may have anticipated. Second, it communicates to domestic audiences that the Iranian leadership remains committed to resisting external pressure rather than yielding to it. And third, it reinforces the position of hardline factions within the Iranian system, many of whom have long argued that strategic vulnerability can only be addressed through stronger deterrent capabilities. This creates what many analysts describe as a nuclear paradox. The very military pressure intended to limit Iran's strategic options may instead strengthen internal arguments in favor of pursuing a nuclear deterrent. Every strike, every escalation, and every diplomatic failure risks reinforcing the belief among influential factions that nuclear capability represents the only reliable guarantee of long-term security. At the same time, ceasefire arrangements have provided opportunities for reconstruction and recovery. Economic relief measures, resumed oil exports, and access to previously restricted financial resources have all contributed to Iran's ability to invest in critical infrastructure. As a result, the debate is no longer solely about political intentions. It is increasingly about capability. And that reality brings the international community closer to a strategic crossroads that many hoped diplomacy would help avoid. The broader strategic picture as of June 28, 2026, is arguably the most concerning combination of developments witnessed since the conflict began. Across the region, multiple crises are unfolding simultaneously. American aircraft have launched a second major round of strikes against Iranian targets within 48 hours. Iran has responded with ballistic missile and drone attacks directed at American positions in Bahrain and Kuwait. Iraqi security forces are engaged in operations against Iranian-aligned political figures in Baghdad. Israeli military activity continues in southern Lebanon. Meanwhile, maritime security remains under severe strain following repeated attacks on commercial shipping in the Strait of Hormuz. At the same time, Iranian state media has openly declared that acquiring a nuclear weapon is now viewed as a strategic necessity. Taken together, these developments paint a picture of a region moving steadily closer to a far more dangerous phase of confrontation. The immediate question facing policymakers in Washington is whether the current military response can achieve a fundamentally different outcome from the one that has emerged repeatedly over recent months. Recent intelligence assessments have complicated that calculation considerably. Senior defense officials have confirmed that Iran has spent the ceasefire period rebuilding key military infrastructure, including air defense systems, missile capabilities, surveillance assets, and drone-related facilities. Many of these are the same systems that previous American operations were intended to degrade. That reality presents a significant strategic challenge. If military strikes successfully damage Iranian capabilities, but ceasefire periods subsequently allow those capabilities to be restored, then the conflict risks becoming trapped in a repetitive cycle. Infrastructure is destroyed, reconstruction follows, and military action eventually resumes. In practical terms, the campaign risks becoming an exercise in managing symptoms rather than resolving underlying causes. Without a diplomatic framework capable of imposing enforceable restrictions and effective verification mechanisms, there is no clear endpoint. Military pressure can delay capability development, but it cannot permanently eliminate it if reconstruction remains possible. This raises fundamental questions about the long-term sustainability of the current approach. Yet military developments are only part of the story. What is taking place in Iraq may ultimately prove just as significant. The Iraqi government's operations against Iranian-aligned political figures target something far more important than individual personalities. They challenge the political networks that have enabled Tehran to maintain influence across Iraqi institutions for years. Should Prime Minister Mohammed Shia al-Sudani pursue a broader campaign against those networks, the consequences could be substantial. Such efforts would weaken the political protection that has often allowed Iranian-backed groups to operate with relative freedom. They could also place additional pressure on militia organizations that rely heavily on political allies for legitimacy, resources, and institutional cover. The critical question is whether recent arrests represent an isolated operation or the beginning of a wider effort to restructure Iraq's political landscape. That answer remains unclear. What is clear, however, is that Baghdad has become another important arena in the wider regional struggle between competing centers of influence. The overall situation remains deeply troubling. The ceasefire that was intended to reduce tensions has instead been followed by multiple rounds of military escalation. Iran has targeted commercial shipping on repeated occasions. The United States has responded with successive retaliatory strikes, each larger than the last. Iranian missiles and drones have been launched against American positions in the Gulf. Nuclear rhetoric has intensified. Iraq has become the scene of significant internal security operations, and fighting continues in Lebanon. Against this backdrop, President Trump has issued one of the strongest public warnings directed at the Iranian state by any American leader in recent history. He has repeatedly stated that continued escalation could ultimately threaten the existence of the Islamic Republic itself. Whether Tehran interprets those statements as a genuine declaration of intent or merely another stage in an ongoing cycle of political signaling remains one of the most important questions facing regional decision-makers. The coming days are likely to provide the answer. For now, the evidence points toward continued escalation rather than de-escalation. Iran has continued attacks on commercial vessels, rebuilt military infrastructure, intensified discussions surrounding nuclear deterrence, and launched missiles at positions linked to the United States and its allies. In response, American military operations remain active. Iraqi security forces continue confronting Iranian-aligned networks. Israeli operations persist in Lebanon. The diplomatic framework that once offered hope of stability appears increasingly fragile. The ceasefire has not formally collapsed, but it now exists under extraordinary pressure. Indeed, it may be only one significant decision away from complete failure. As governments across the Middle East, Europe, and North America assess the situation, one conclusion is becoming increasingly difficult to avoid. The region has entered a decisive moment. Strategic choices made in the coming days could determine whether this crisis moves toward containment or expands into a broader and far more dangerous confrontation. For now, uncertainty dominates. But the trajectory is unmistakable. Tensions are rising, military activity is increasing, and the margin for diplomatic recovery is narrowing with every passing hour.